Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. We're going to start this program with a couple of minutes of great music. You've just heard a recording of the Missouri Waltz, the music Harry Truman was playing when Lauren Bacall was boosted atop of the upright piano to pose for what has become the most famous photograph taken in the club. That was 80 years ago this month. How famous was it? When Lauren Becall died in August 2014, reporters and obituary writers called the club to get the story behind the photo. It had not been forgotten. I am Gil Klein, the chair of the club's History and Heritage team, and author of Tales from the National Press Club. All this is in here. It's available at the front desk. So we are here today to talk about what led up to that photo, the reaction to it, the role of the club in World War II, and Harry Truman's legacy in club history. It was just one example of how the club's history is immersed in national, world, and social history that every member should know and be proud of. First, I want to thank club archivist Jeff Schlossberg for all of his help in putting this together. We have a treasure trove in the archives. There he is. But Jeff went beyond that to go to the Library of Congress to gather more information and video and audio that you will see. Since not everyone here is an authority on the club's history, I want to start with a quick tutorial about how it came to be and its relationship with U.S. presidents from Teddy Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt before we launch into Harry Truman. During the Civil War, Washington suddenly became the focal point of news, and out-of-town newspapers sent correspondents to D.C. They took over buildings along 14th Street between E and F and along F Street, and that all became known as Newspaper Row. The illustration here came from an 1873 Harper's Magazine, from an article that described how those bureaus worked. The reporters were to crank out their copy and then hustle down to the Western Union telegraph office to send the stories back home. Now, when the club was founded in 1908, Pennsylvania at 14th Street looked like this. You can see the Washington Post there on E Street, one of 4 daily newspapers within walking distance of this spot. Reporters wanted a place where they could go after hours, hoist a few, smoke cigars, play poker, swap stories, enjoy each other's company. So on a cold and blustery day in February 1908, a reporter from the old Washington Times crossed 14th Street at F, just steps from where the press building is today. He walked on crutches because he had a leg amputated in an accident. He wore a big Stetson hat and he spoke with what was described as a big Bertha voice. And he loved to play poker. And he ran into his colleague James Hay and he said, "I am sick to death of having to hunt up a stuffy old boarding house room every time I want to turn a card. Hell's bells, why don't we get us up a press club?" And his teeth chattering, he said, "How? Where?" And Nichols says, "I don't know and I don't give a damn, but we're going to have a press club." And with that, he hobbled down to the police headquarters, went up to the press room, passed around a petition. Who wants to join, who wants to start a press club? Put up $10 here, which was about half a week's salary. By the end of March, it came to be. The club was founded in the Round Robin Bar in the Willard, and there's an historical plaque outside of it. It was founded, of course, as an all-men's club, which remained long past the days of Truman's presidency. With an inaugural party in 1908, the first clubhouse was at 1205 F Street in 3 stories above a jewelry store. It quickly outgrew that and moved to in 1909 above a drugstore at 15th and F Street in the building that had been the Rhodes Tavern. By 2014, it had outgrown that and rented 2 stories at the top of the Albee building up the block. That building is now known as the Metropolitan Bank Building. Cheers. By the mid-1920s, the club's leaders had a brilliant idea of building a high-rise right here. The concept was to gather all of these out-of-town bureaus into one building, and their rents would pay for the club. It was completed in 1927, and the club moved in that December. So now let's get down to the presidents. Every one of them, from Theodore Roosevelt to Donald Trump, has visited and spoken at the club either before, during, or after their presidencies, sometimes all 3. TR came in 1910 after he was president, when he returned to the United States as a hero following his safari in Africa. Here is a Cliff Berryman cartoon showing him describing his daring do in the jungle. He came back a couple of other times, mostly to denounce Woodrow Wilson's First World War policies. William Howard Taft was the first sitting president to visit the club. He dropped by on January 31st, 1910, shortly after setting out for a drive in a motor car. He hoisted his 300-pound-plus body up the narrow stairs, and the bartender gave him a glass of water, and Taft gave the bartender a rosebud from his lapel. Taft said one of the things he missed about being president was that nobody drops in. He talked about walking the streets of Washington, and few people recognized him. Taft maintained his membership even after he became Chief Justice. Now, Woodrow Wilson joined the club before he was even governor of New Jersey. He was listed in the 1914 club yearbook as an author. As governor, he participated in many club activities. As he became president, or after he became president, he and his cabinet attended the club's first Press vs. Politicians spelling bee. Wilson was once quoted as saying, "The press club was the one place he could go to unwind." Think about that. Imagine that. At one point, he dropped by and got to talking about what he would rather be doing than being president. It was off the record, but the reporters convinced him to allow them to use it. This cartoon, also by Berryman, ran in the Washington Star. Wilson showing all the things he'd rather be doing. Wilson was back in 1916, a year after the sinking of the Lusitania, to give a somber speech about how he was wrestling to decide if and when the United States should enter the war. Warren Harding was a newspaper publisher before he went into politics, and that made him eligible to be a voting member of the club. Here he is voting in the 1921 club elections. From the time he was senator through his presidency, Harding enjoyed dropping into the club to play poker. As I mentioned, the club decided to build its own building in 1926. Since it was having a hard time raising money, the organizers came up with a scheme to have a cornerstone laying ceremony and invited President Calvin Coolidge to speak. Once Coolidge was gone, they hid the cornerstone. But now they had the President of the United States endorsing the project, which helped them raise the money. I don't have a photo of Herbert Hoover in the club while he was president, but I know he attended the club's presidential inaugural party in January 1932 for President Bascom Timmons. He came back in 1954 here to give a final report on the Hoover Commission on Government Reform. Franklin Roosevelt came to the club several times between his election in 1932 and 1940. Here he is accepting his membership card. You can imagine how painful it was for the crippled president to stand up for this photograph. He was honored at a couple of dinners, and here he is conferring with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, while club president Arthur Hatchton pretended not to be listening. His last time at the club was during a dinner after he won the 1940 election for a third term. This cartoon was prominently displayed. All of that lead-in sets the stage for Harry Truman. Our first photo of Truman at the club is a mystery. It's something that floats around eBay from time to time, being sold as a reproduction, but it comes with no identifying information. This is definitely the National Press Club. The seal is on the back. And that's Truman at the piano. But who are these other men? I can only surmise it was taken when Truman was a senator. Were the other guys also senators? There once was a group called the Singing Senators. That was much later. If anyone can identify the others, please let me know. After he became president, Truman showed up at the club for the first time to take part in a presidential inaugural party for incoming club president Edward Jameson of the Houston Chronicle on January 29, 1945. Entertaining that night was Jack Benny, which this room knows who Jack Benny is. That's good. Star of the most popular radio show of the time. If you look to the left of the Truman piano in the Truman Lounge, there's a photo of Truman at the piano with Benny with his famous violin playing for Jameson, his parents and wife, before the festivities began. Unfortunately, the club wouldn't let me take it off the wall to show it here. What I do have is even better. With the caption, "Beginning of a long friendship," this photo shows Benny reaching out to Truman with his cigar. It goes on to read, "Mr. Vice President, would you please hold my cigar?" Says perennial funny man Jack Benny to Mr. Truman, just a few seconds before Mr. Benny started the broadcast part of the inaugural program for President Jameson. And here's a photo of Truman with his wife Bess enjoying the show. That picture did not run until Truman became president. Now, we need to set the stage both figuratively and literally for what was coming just 2 weeks later. It begins in November 1942, when the club received a call from the chaplain of the HMS Essex, then being refitted at the Norfolk Navy Yard. The chaplain had 80 sailors seeking to come to Washington for sightseeing. Where should they go for entertainment? A few members got together and arranged for the sailors to come to the club and drink all the beer they could hold. It was such a hit, imagine that the club quickly made it a weekly affair sponsored by the American Legion Post, which was formed in 1923 with World War I veterans that included John J. Pershing. So, dubbed the National Press Club Canteen, every Saturday, the ballroom was open to any American or Allied servicemen who wanted to come. It soon became a principal port of call for every sailor, soldier, or Marine on weekend leave. The numbers quickly rose into the hundreds. The affair was for enlisted men, no brass need apply, but the club thought the servicemen would like to see some representatives of the nation who were sending them around the world to fight. Senators, representatives, cabinet members, and even 8 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court showed up. Some of the men found it amusing that they were eating Frankfurters with Justice Felix Frankfurter. The politicians could make informal remarks, but they were limited to 2 minutes. During the height of the canteens, in 1944-45, about 800 servicemen attended each week, coming to 10,000 for the session. Average consumption each Saturday ran to 15 barrels of beer, 4 cases of soft drinks, 1,500 hot dogs, several cans of potato chips, pretzels, and popcorn. All of this was paid for by contributions by club members. During the session, most of the servicemen were wearing campaign ribbons, decorations for valor or wounded stripes that attested to their combat experience. But what appealed to them most, according to one article written at the time, was that the air of informality and the complete absence of rules or mothering hens. Military bands played, the Marine Band, the Army Band, the Air Corps Band, the Coast Guard Band. Bands from local military bases appeared. They played boogie-woogie. Entertainers showed up for the impromptu performances, including the entire chorus of Earl Carroll's Follies. That might be them. Here is the famed Glenn Miller Band along the back here. And that's Miller himself in the up there on the upper left-hand side. Not too long before his plane disappeared over the English Channel in December 1945. Here's the Navy Band. Even Eleanor Roosevelt showed up. And that brings us to February 10th, 1945. Lauren Bacall's big breakthrough hit, To Have and Have Not, had just been released. She and her co-star, Humphrey Bogart, had begun an affair that was capturing some headlines. Just as an aside, this ad was for the Earl Theater, which soon was renamed the Warner Theater, right around the corner from the press building. What struck me is that along with showing the movie, at a midnight showing nonetheless, was that the evening included a number of lively variety acts. That's entertainment. As a part of the movie's publicity, Warner Brothers Studio wanted Becall to appear at the Press Club Canteen. At first she balked, saying she wanted to be with Bogey, but after a personal appearance with Jack Warner, she relented. Her press agent, Charles Enfield, came with her. You can see from this photo that day that she did not seem real happy at first to be there. The woman on her left, or to the left, was Gracie Barry, a singer who was appearing at the Capitol theater singing Rum and Coca-Cola. I'm sure you know her. Anything can be found on the internet. At the same time, Truman was relatively unknown after Roosevelt plucked him out of the Senate to be his running mate. And he was living in an apartment on Connecticut Avenue. He had been vice president for 3 weeks. He told his wife, Bess, he was going to the press club to entertain the troops. After all, he was an accomplished piano player. It was an all-men's club. What could possibly go wrong? Truman could not play the type of popular music the servicemen enjoyed. He loved classical music. Mozart and Chopin were his favorites. He was once quoted as saying, "I don't like modern music any more than I like modern art. It's a lot of noise." But judging from the press reports the next day, the servicemen didn't care what the vice president played, as long as they were looking at Lauren Bacall. The Washington Star reported the next day that 800 men in uniform were squeezed into the ballroom. It said Miss Becall was hustled out onto the stage by her Warner Brothers escorts. Then the vice president, standing in the wing, was asked if he could return to the stage and play the piano for the photographers. Miss Becall was boosted onto the piano, and the photographers went to work while servicemen shouted, "Down in front!" The press club was so smitten by the event that it turned this photo into a postcard. "Wow," sighed a Marine to a sailor, quoted in the Washington Post. "She's a real sizzler." How did the soldiers and sailors react to the look, Bacall's trademark sultry appearance? The Star said they clapped and stamped, cheered and whistled, all evidence that they liked it pretty well. While women journalists were not allowed in the club, Becall met with a group of them earlier at a reception. The Star reported that she declared she was not going to talk about her leading man, Bogart, who violated current Hollywood ethics by saying he was engaged to her while he was still married. In her memoir, By Myself and Then Some, Becall remembered the day this way. The club was jammed that day. Vice President Truman was coming over, and he was introduced after me. He sat down to play the piano, which was conveniently been placed on stage. Charlie, who was standing on one side of the floor, edged me on the corner of the stage and said, "Get on the piano." I felt a bit silly, but I did it. Cameras started flashing. The vice president and I exchanged some words, and the resulting pictures hit the front pages all over the world in a few days. And so Charlie Enfield was worth every cent and more that Warner paid him. Truman was not wild about the picture after he became president, but I loved it. Bess Truman definitely didn't love it. She never saw the sense of humor in it at all and berated her husband for undignified behavior and didn't let him forget it. Yes, the photo was seen around the world. On February 26, 1945, Life magazine, with the cover shown here, and put the photo in on a full-page spread. Now, you can get anything on the internet. So there's the spread. Just an aside, a couple of things caught my interest in this magazine. Opposite of the page with Truman and Becall was a full-page summary of what happened with Franklin Roosevelt's summit in Yalta with Stalin and Churchill. While Truman was playing the piano, Roosevelt was remaking the world. Yet the president gave Truman no inside knowledge about that summit, even though he had just a few weeks to live, plopping Truman in the White House to figure everything out on his own. The other thing that caught my interest in that magazine are stories of the worst of the winter fighting in the war, yet the end was in sight. VE Day was 3 months away. The magazine was full of ads with women in negligees and for engagement rings. Yes, the launch of the baby boom was advertised in this magazine. On April 12th, Truman suddenly became president after Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia. The whole world fell on his shoulders. His relations with the press were often strained, and here he is with his famous headline on election night of 1948. But even after he became president, he still was a frequent visitor to the club. Truman attended the February 6, 1945 inaugural party for Paul Wooten of New Orleans Times-Picayune, sending him a letter the next day saying, "Mrs. Truman and I enjoyed being present at your inauguration. Our only regret was that we couldn't stay through the whole ceremony, but we had an engagement with Justice Stone to visit an art gallery at 9 o'clock. I know you will have a most successful administration because you have the common sense to make it go." That letter is, by the way, available on eBay for $900 if anyone is interested in purchasing it for the National Press Club. I'll bet you can get it for less. Now, here is Truman in the club in 1949. He was holding a new club history, Dateline Washington, the story of national affairs journalism. With him is the book's editor, Cable Phillips. I'll give my best, Harry Truman. This is really a gem of a book. It was composed of chapters written by club members, and one chapter was written by Bruce Catton, who went on to be one of the great Civil War historians in the 1960s. And one was by Fletcher Nebel, who went on to write popular political fiction, including 7 Days in May, that became a box office success. Also in 1949, Truman was back in the club with his daughter, Margaret. It was the first public appearance of the two after Margaret's unfortunate appearance singing at Constitution Hall. The Washington Post music critic Paul Hume criticized the performance, saying Margaret's voice was flat. Harry wrote a letter to Hume threatening to beat him up. No fisticuffs at this event, however, and Margaret did not sing. But as Anthony Laviero wrote in a story about Truman's music ability in the New York Times Sunday magazine in 1950, the last time a fairly large number of persons heard Truman play was at the National Press Club's father-daughter dinner. Pride and sentiment were rampant. Impulsively, Father Truman made a fitting gesture. He led his daughter to the piano. They sat down on the bench together and with 4 hands played the Jenny Lind polka, just the way they used to do it back in Independence. On another occasion, Truman attended a Founders Day dinner at the club. As Liviero wrote, Stan Freeman, a New York pianist, was playing Chopin's waltz in A-flat. Truman was a little incensed at the noisy crowd that was not paying attention. Mr. Freeman deserved a more attentive audience because he played well. Freeman would have been most gratified if he could have seen the chief executive rise from his seat in the midst of the noisy crowd. Deserting the Secret Service guards and his friends, Mr. Truman walked to a point close to the stage. He listened intently, nodding his head to the rhythm, and poured his admiration of Mr. Freeman's technique into the ear of a reporter. Now, let's see if we can make this work. Truman came to the club several more times. In 1961, he spoke at the club with President John Cosgrove. What did he say? Let's listen.
To be back here again just 13 years after you took my picture with the gal on the piano, and I thought maybe you'd have her here again today, but you didn't. And she's a wonderfully nice person. She's all right. That some damn press fella who was trying to make a promotion for her thought he was doing a smart trick. I don't think he did. I think he caused her trouble, but caused me a hell of a lot of trouble at home. As a long-time member of the National Press Club, I like to come back here occasionally and see how well you fellows are taking care of this wonderful organization. You know, I never had any quarrel with the working press. The editors and publishers that I used to cuss, and I still cuss them. And I understand that you do too. I'm pleased to report that the results of my investigation here today are rather favorable. You heard me say that word rather favorable. I believe that John Cosgrove and his fellow officers are doing a good job. I wish they're here and now to make a vote of confidence on the present administration of the National Press Club.
Truman came to the club for the last time in 1964 when the club threw an 80th birthday party for him. Here he is with club president Joseph Deere of Deere Publications before the party. And what's a party without a cake and candles? Now, anyone looking closely at these two photos will note that Harry Truman is in a different suit and wearing different glasses. That's because this was not the first birthday party the club threw for Truman. But we didn't have a photo of Truman and the cake from the last one. But hey, a birthday cake is a birthday cake. As to the piano itself, it has for decades been in the suitably named Truman Lounge. Only a bunch of reporters would not have thought to call it the Bacall Lounge, but it apparently suffered a lot of damage, so many people wanted to climb on top of it. So if you take a close look at it, you can see it does not look like the one in the photos. Now, former President Frank Holman, who I trust, told me that the outer casing was so damaged by people climbing on top of it that it had to be replaced. But the innards and the keyboard, he insisted, were the same, and I'm taking that as the truth. Now, please don't do this. But I did take a peek inside the piano. I was hoping to see a date it was built. Not there, but it's definitely a very old piano. Heinzman and Company produced high-quality upright pianos in Toronto from 1866 to 1978. The club keeps it in tune, as you will find out soon, but it bars anyone from getting on top of it, and you can't play it without permission. And again, please don't look inside. Please respect the piano. As soon as we are finished here, members and their guests can adjourn to the Truman Lounge, where a pianist will be playing the piano while we enjoy tacos. Truman's grandson, Clifton Daniel, visited the club in November 2006, sitting at the piano with club member Steve Carson. He confided that the Truman women had no sense of humor about the photo. So let's get some final words in here from people who knew Truman, who knew him well. In 2020, Clifton Truman Daniel spoke virtually to the club with club president Mike Friedman, formerly of CBS Radio. It was a three-way conversation with Kurt Graham, who was director of the Truman Library. Here's what Clifton had to say about Lauren Bacall.
Okay, so speaking of music, we can't end this wonderful interview without going back to the most famous photograph ever taken here at the Press Club of then Vice President Truman playing the upright piano with the model and movie actress Lauren Bacall draped across the top of it, both happily gazing at each other. It happened on a Saturday at a canteen here at the club, and we talked about those earlier. We understand that Bess Truman was not too happy about that photo, which of course was splashed over newspapers across the country and was on the cover of Life magazine. What can you tell us about the photo and its aftermath in the Truman family?
Well, you said it. My grandmother and Grandpa. I will argue with you about that he was not gazing happily at Lauren Bacall. She was gazing down at him. As you said, it was a stunt that her press agent put her up to and hoisted her up on the piano. Grandpa had been grinning from ear to ear prior to that photograph being taken, and the smile has dimmed considerably because he knows who's going to see this. And sure enough, when he went home that evening, my grandmother was stonily silent for a while, and then said very quietly, "I don't think you should play the piano in public anymore." And I don't think he did. But he was a very, very accomplished classical pianist. In fact, he himself famously once said, if it hadn't been for politics, he'd have wound up piano player in a whorehouse. And really, there's hardly any difference.
So let's give the last word. Well, first of all, yes, let's give the last word to Margaret Truman Daniel, who spoke at the club during my presidency in 1994. Here is a short clip of what she had to say about the piano and Truman's relations with the club.
From that era, I understand that the piano, which is not in here but upstairs, that Lauren Bacall sat on top, her long legs dangling down beside Dad. Mother, incidentally, was not amused by that picture. The last time my father came here was when he celebrated his 80th birthday in Washington. He made two speeches, one to a joint meeting of Congress and another to the National Press Club. He had a whale of a good time.
A whale of a good time. How many presidents have said that about their visits to the club? Truman, in fact, as I said, remained a dues-paying member of the club until his death. I checked the membership list from 1958, and sure enough, there he was among the non-resident members, the Honorable Harry Truman, Independence, Missouri. And that may be why the club honored him with not one but two birthday parties. It was a different time. But the club has the same purpose. Just for a moment, allow me to emphasize the importance of this club. You should be a member because after more than a century, the club remains a focal point as one of the nation's leading journalism organizations. It has a history that is incomparable in the news business. Every major event of the 20th and the 21st century has passed through our doors. The club continues to have international impact, and it stands for press freedom in the United States and around the world. And if any of you should think about, you might want to become an officer of the club. Again, for more than a century, journalists and communicators have volunteered their time to make the club work. You would be standing on the shoulders of thousands of volunteers who have met the challenges of history to protect and enhance the club. The club is depending on you to provide your expertise and to keep it vital. So now, hey, it's taco night. One more reason to enjoy your membership. Head on up to the reliable source to keep the festivities going as we celebrate Harry and Lauren Becall with a pianist up there playing the piano. And if they were still with us, I am sure Graham Nickel and James Hay would be there, but they would be playing poker at the back table. So thank you all for coming.